Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Lights, Camera, Accolade. Today, we are going to be talking about the second Academy Awards. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Jake.
And I'm Chrysantha.
So, the second Academy Awards ceremony was held in April 1930. The movies that were produced were between 1928 and 1929. We're still in an era of Hollywood where it's like they're kind of playing catch up with the movies that came out that they're looking at being eligible for awards. In some ways, they were still figuring stuff out, much like us. So there were some changes to formatting. In the first Academy Awards, we didn't mention this last time, so surprise for our listeners, there's going to be information trickling in throughout. But in the first Academy Awards, they had actually announced winners and nominees in advance, so everyone already knew who won, you know, when they walked through the doors of the awards ceremony, which I think makes it just a little bit less exciting. You're not really engaged when you already know that you lost. So This was at least a fun time where they got to find out all together.
I think you bring up a good point. Like that first Academy Awards, if you weren't a winner, that had to have been kind of a, really frustrating couple of hours sitting there. I mean, where's the drama of the show? Where's the Will Smith slaps, the unexpected twists and turns? None of it was there. It was like a show trial, basically. So I'm glad they made those changes because I don't know that it would have developed into the beloved institution we know and enjoy now if it was just like a press release,
Yeah, definitely. It's become kind of a spectacle that obviously a ton of people enjoy watching every year. The other exciting part about this year is we've now officially entered the era of the talkie. We have sound movies as our only nominees this year. So previously, The Jazz Singer as the first feature-length talkie had come out the year prior, but it was actually deemed ineligible for awards because they thought that it wouldn't be fair to other movies, that it would just sweep in every category. So kind of unfortunate for them, but here we are. But anyway, the nominees for this year are In Old Arizona, The Alibi, Hollywood Revue, The Patriot, and of course the winner this year, Broadway Melody. And honestly, we haven't watched Broadway Melody yet, but so far I think that I kind of liked our batch of silent movies more. I don't know if that's just me.
I would have to second that. I don't know, maybe it's just because of like the transition from having to act without sound and then now relying on dialogue. With any kind of transition from something new, you're definitely learning how to make something come across a lot better, especially on a big screen.
You're kind of forced to notice and cue in on different things.
Right.
Yeah, that is true. Because I did find myself with the silent movies, really looking at each character and having to really rely on intuition, because the cue card will give you like a general idea of what's happening with that certain scene, and then you have like a few seconds or minutes with them just moving, and then you have to kind of infer about what's happening after the cue card. And so, like, as a viewer, you're definitely you have more responsibility in understanding or picking up on what the director wants.
The sensation I had is like, if everyone can remember, like when you're a little kid and you're watching two adults speak and you don't really understand what they're talking about, like it's a complex adult topic and your child brain is like trying to fill in the gaps or determine like in your own way, like your fantasy of what they're referring to. I don't want to sound all negative when we start talking about the talkies because I really did enjoy a lot of aspects of some of these nominees that we've watched so far.
Yeah. I guess on that note, do you want to jump into our summaries?
Right, I'll take the reins here. I always love talking about the movies that we watch. So the first one I just want to knock out right off the bat, just because I think it made us feel the most emotions in kind of a visceral way, and maybe you guys can expound on that. But the Hollywood Review, I mean, this thing, the phrase astroturfed, it's like artificial just comes to mind. This was a movie that the studio obviously developed just to showcase their talent, but it was about 2.5 hours of a showcasing of all the signed talent for a particular studio. What studio was
It
it,
was
Sarah?
MGM. Yeah, it was
MGM,
MGM.
which was one of the big guys then. They spent about 2.5 hours just having their big stars of the time doing little performances, little kind of vignettes, some impressive dance numbers, but for the most part, just kind of like awkward, hackneyed interactions and forced comedy. And it was tough to get through, but we did because we're completionists and
Or we did
because we
mostly
care
get
about
through it.
you
One of us
guys.
may have
Well,
fallen asleep.
Yes, I fell asleep.
I wasn't going to name names. I think it was the first nominee we watched this year, and that was my unfortunate choice because I saw that it was listed as a musical comedy.
musical skeptics vindicated.
But it's not a musical. This is like essentially maybe vaudeville acts, talent show. It really, as Jake said, was just trying to showcase MGM's big stars at the time. It is where Singin' in the Rain comes from. So whether you know that from the movie Singin' in the Rain or whether you know that from Clockwork Orange, very different vibes there.
That's what I knew it from.
Yeah, but that is where it comes from. And I believe I actually haven't seen Singin' in the Rain, but to my understanding, it's about a like silent movie star who struggles with the new implementation of sound. And I think it's directly set in this MGM era, hence Singin' in the Rain and all of that. I think that's what it's about. I could be completely wrong, but watching Hollywood Revue, if that movie is about someone who is like anti-sound movies, I feel like I'm on board. I'm with him. Like no sound, no Hollywood Revue. 2 thumbs down.
Yeah, that was a rough. I'd hate to think somebody in that year that was their first sound picture.
Like it probably was more exciting, right, to see the stars kind of showcased, and vaudeville shows and those types of acts were popular at the time as well, anyway. So I'm sure it was received better than it was by us. You know, I won't speak for all modern audiences. Maybe there are people out there who still would really enjoy it, but that ain't me.
Yeah, I mean, I can probably say that too since I fell asleep. I will say that, I mean, I do recognize Joan Crawford. I mean, she did appear, and I feel like she's a very well-known
very
name.
young.
And I do think the Technicolor sequence was pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's true.
I wouldn't recommend you watch it just for that, but that's a notable standout in that movie.
Maybe like a clip. Just watch clips of like the good parts of it. But
yeah,
the yoga belly dancing Eastern dancing scene. I don't know. That was cool.
I guess I'm being extremely harsh on it because of how. I'll just say how unenjoyable it was to sit through 2 hours of it, but there were definitely, some good sequences and stuff.
Yeah, that movie definitely, it did not need to be 2 hours.
It did not.
But maybe we can move on to some of our other movies.
Just wanted to touch on The Patriot, which is kind of a historical movie about a revolution or a coup d'etat, I should say, that took place in Tsarist Russia. But unfortunately, a film that has been lost to time. And this kind of touches on an issue that I think it's good for us to mention, just at least briefly anyway, about what an issue it is now with film preservation. From many films from this era are unfortunately, the original prints of them are degrading and ultimately becoming unsalvageable. So I know there's a big push among many directors and filmmakers today. People like Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg are very passionate about this, but doing everything they can to preserve these early films.
Yeah. I was not aware of just how many films were lost to time. So that was kind of eye-opening, especially to the point where like a Oscar nominee was lost to time. So much less, older movies or movies that didn't get maybe as much attention and acclaim. I feel like we're so much of the era where it's like nothing is ever gone forever. Once it's on the internet or anything, it's just like, it's there. So kind of having those constraints of physical media and losing so much to time is, it's sad. Like it's unfortunate to have lost so much of that like early formative Hollywood like history and film.
It really is our shared cultural heritage. I hope that preservation efforts are more successful.
Yeah, definitely. Forward. And can't believe that it wasn't Hollywood Revue that got lost.
Next up, We have a movie called The Alibi, which was a little bit like similar vibe almost again to The Racket in that it is a crime film, but this one was interesting. It dives into this whole question of a former criminal who gets out of jail, and on the surface of things, he's trying to reacclimate to normal life. And in the course of that, he falls for the daughter of a very prominent policeman. And the policeman is immediately kind of wary of this situation. And soon in the movie, there's a shooting of a police officer by a gang. And so he immediately suspects that this guy is not so good after all, and that he's falling back into his old ways. And the movie really centers on kind of this tireless pursuit from this police officer and his comrades to kind of implicate this guy who's actually, as it turns out, still at the center of a criminal empire. Ultimately, I think the thing that's really controversial about the movie is that the police go to extreme lengths and employ tactics that we would consider highly problematic and illegal in the modern day. Again, I know it does unfortunately happen sometimes. But in any case, it makes for an interesting movie.
It did, in a lot of ways, have very critical views of cops. And so police in Chicago were worried that that would cause even more crime or anti-cop sentiment. And that's the reason that it was largely banned. But
yeah, I find that interesting though, because like at the time with crime dramas in general, or just kind of like being influenced by the Prohibition era and like what people went through, or, you know, try to do things underground and stuff. I feel like the fascination with, I guess, crime stories and organized crime in general, like it's just interesting to have the complete opposite of, you know, the public's fascination with crime dramas, and then having the big wigs being like, no, we don't want to send this message out anymore. They want to reinstill, you know, trust and, I guess,
in
control.
Police,
yeah, in the police.
Because I think that is part of it. Because other crime movies, you have like the intrigue of crime. Like we even saw that with The Racket, right? But you have like a good upstanding cop. You have like cops in a favorable light a lot of the time, where it's kind of like a good guys versus bad guys. It's much simpler. Even if you do have some corrupt cops, there's the overarching message that the force as a whole is not corrupt. Whereas in this one, I feel like it was at least a bit more nuanced than that, where it's like, no, you know, most of these guys are, you know, just as morally gray as the mobsters in this case. And they also do what they need to do to achieve whatever their goals are. And in that case, it's largely, you know, putting people in prison who may or may not deserve it. Like that's kind of the point with Chester Morris's character, right? Is that he gets out of prison and he's like, oh, I'm reformed. And yet the cops are still like treating me like I'm a criminal, but I'm like a new man. But then obviously turns out he is. Spoilers, like he is still very much in crime. But just that sentiment, right, of that does happen to people. And I'm sure that happened to people at the time, where they would truly get out of prison and try to walk kind of a straight life, but you're always under the microscope from that point on.
That is true. That's a good point.
I think it's really important to keep in mind that we're talking about a time period prior to DNA evidence. And to me, it's always like really disturbing to think about not only the people who significant chunks of their life were stolen from them on faulty grounds, but also people who were actually executed, because execution was much more widespread in this time period, because some police officers, maybe they would make assumptions and form their conclusions before they looked at evidence, or just wanted to get the right, you know, numbers at the end of each quarter, however their metrics were being kept.
Yeah, it's kind of whether or not, whether it was accidental or malicious, like purposeful, the result is kind of the same, where, yeah, you do have innocent people who are charged with crimes, and it was easier back then, because this still happens today, right?
Of course.
So even more so, like you're saying, the fact that it was even easier back then, because so much of it was like, well, it's our word versus yours. And if someone just plants some evidence, it's like, okay, you don't have forensics, you don't have like any of that. So it's just like, well, we found it, so that's that.
Kind of scary when you think about it in those terms, but still an interesting movie, certainly.
For sure.
We also watched a movie called In Old Arizona. It was a Western. We talked about how we have mixed expectations about Westerns, but this was kind of an interesting one. It's about a vigilante in Arizona, of course, in the desert, named the Cisco Kid, who's very charismatic. And though he survives off of grifting and robbing, he does so according to his own sort of personal code of chivalry. But eventually he becomes renowned enough that the authorities call in some expert outlaw hunters, and we're introduced to a very kind of swaggering New York character who his job is to hunt down the Cisco Kid and bring him to justice. And what starts on the face of it as kind of like almost like a good guy versus bad guy, it kind of ends unexpectedly. I was pretty taken aback in a sense, but also like impressed by kind of the unexpected turns that it takes. I know that there was a little bit of races
brown
playing
face.
races. Yeah. That's the correct terminology, right? What?
Yeah, I know Chrysanthi also had ideas and feelings about that. I definitely, just watching the film, right, you have two white actors who are putting on just the most cartoonish accents of I think ultimately in the film he was supposed to be Spanish, but his lady love is definitely Mexican. Her whole family's Mexican. So it's just like these very exaggerated accents that took me out of the movie in a lot of ways. But representation of the characters definitely wasn't all negative, especially the Cisco Kid was very positively portrayed. So it was nice
Cisco
to
Kid was cool.
Have that. He was very cool. I have other thoughts about the movie in general, but I know I want Chrysanthi to be able to talk to.
Yeah, I know when I was doing the initial research in old Arizona, that was something that was a notable standout, was like obviously brown face and black face was kind of normalized at the time. And so I thought when watching it, it would kind of put me off, because I don't know, a couple of years ago, what is it? West Side Story. And they do the same thing, kind of. I think they were supposed to be portraying Puerto Ricans.
They are
and
from
so
Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm.
I could not go through that movie just because of how exaggerated it was. And I was like, I don't know, I just couldn't immerse myself in it. And I kind of had that same experience with this one. And I'm not saying like I was enraged or anything like that. Because I feel like the acting, like I think, what's the actor's name? Was it Warner Baxter?
I did not take.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's okay. Warner Baxter. And so like his portrayal of the Cisco Kid in that movie won him, Best Actor award. And I don't like to attribute it like as an excuse, different times and stuff. But unfortunately, it's just part of history and it is what it is. And I'm not going to sit here and say the movie was bad. Like it was enjoyable. There was like comedic relief. It was, I guess, as being one of the first kind of Westerns to have sound and kind of like pave that way for Westerns in the future. I mean, there's some respect in there. If you're, a minority, and that stuff kind of like puts you off and you're interested in watching the movie, just keep that in mind. So I guess that's a little bit of a trigger warning, but overall, I did enjoy the movie. It was a little hard to hear because the sound wasn't great.
Sound design was not good.
It's a good point.
Yeah, so there was a lot of dialogue that I kind of missed when watching. So in a way, I guess it was kind of like watching a silent film. But yeah, those are my thoughts on, I guess, the controversy with that film.
Yeah.
How about those dialects, though? I did love some of those voices. I mean, just the terminology that, in particular, that character from New York uses. It almost felt like an older form of English.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting from an acting perspective because it's like almost a whole new toolbox to play with. That dialect. Yeah.
Now that sound is an option, then to really have fun with it, right? So we saw that with like all of the different accents and stuff in this movie, which seems like a purposeful choice. Because before on a cue card, what are you going to put like in parentheses, like in a super exaggerated Mexican accent? Like you can't really get that same sort of sensation. So I liked that. that element of it, at least for like the reasons that I can assume that they were making. And again, it was just nice to see that minorities weren't portrayed fully negatively, whether that be as like the villains or the bandits or being just like servants and stuff. This was at least a little bit more nuanced. And Jake, I know you mentioned a surprising ending. The movie's based on a short story by O. Henry. So if you're familiar with O. Henry's work, there's a lot of, I feel like he's studied a lot for his use of irony, right? Like various forms of irony. So there are always like these interesting twists or miscommunications and stuff. And so the ending definitely plays a little bit into that, but in a pretty dark way. So of course I liked it. That was probably one of my favorite parts about the movie.
Sarah's card.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it was okay. It was enjoyable, kind of like both of you have said.
I was doing some research because like when I couldn't understand anything they're saying, and I know at the time with sound becoming more accepted or used in Hollywood, that there were like two different types. So it was movie tone and Vitatone, and Vitatone was kind of like the original one. That is kind of like the process that was used for making or filming the Jazz Singer. So they had a phonograph record in sync with the film, which allowed for synchronized dialogue, music, and whatever sound effects that they added. I think they were both created around the same time. I mean, the same year, 1926. I don't know like the months or like how far apart they were, but
the exact day.
Yeah. And then I do know like a more updated system came out called the Movie Tone system, and that was made by Fox Film Corporation. And that one is the one that actually became more adopted and paved the way for sound in movies and allowed for more clear sounds in films in general, because it allowed the system to record directly on the film strip and provided better synchronization and sound quality in general. I think it also helped with like other production advancements with like, I think, involvement of the boom mic. So it allowed for different placements and stuff like that. I'm not going to sit here and say that it improved a lot of the sound quality, but for the time it was very, like, it was clear to them. But in Old Arizona and the Alibi both used the Movie Tone system, and then the Hollywood Revue used some other one called Photophone, just because MGM wanted to use their own sound system, I guess, because they wanted to be unique.
Did just remind, like, while I was going through old newspapers, I found a random article that was talking about sound in movies and how that actually may have played a role in furthering the demand for censorship and pushing the Hays Code forward, like on top of the various controversies and stuff, because apparently with silent films, different theater owners would feel at liberty to just cut and splice the film as necessary. So they would do like in-house censorship and just be like, people don't need to see that. And so every theater, every region had like their own control over what audiences saw. So if you saw a movie in like Tennessee and then went up to visit someone in Chicago and watched the same movie, you might be like, what? This is a totally different movie. But once sound got introduced, they couldn't really do that as easily anymore.
Right.
So there were a lot of like theater owners and managers and stuff who then started all of the various like dialogues about like, no, we must pass widespread censorship and regulations because we can't just cut the movie like we want to anymore. So that's crazy. I had no idea that was a thing and just happened upon that article.
How maddening.
That's really interesting. I know.
That must have been, like, from a creative perspective, like from the director. Like,
yeah, and I have to imagine with the Alibi, had it been a silent movie, they probably would have just cut the film in various, theaters to get rid of anything that was controversial. It would have just been like the opening and ending credits. That's it. We got it. But yeah, sound definitely had a really big impact, obviously, in a lot of ways.
You also have the added element of, like diversity. Talkies in general just kind of expand a little bit more about different stories that can be told with, having a different dialogues, accents, different kind of being able to hear different things. I mean, I know at the time when it comes to accessibility and diversity, it wasn't a really big thing as much as it is now. But I feel like without ever having that technological improvement in film, we wouldn't be where we are now, and we wouldn't be having certain conversations when it involves, diversity and inclusivity in modern day film if it hadn't been for, how do we introduce sound into film? How do we make, how do we make the characters more believable? How do we stop doing brown face or black face, in movies to make it more, less demeaning and more accepting,
I love that idea where with sound you get to tell more of those stories. I do think on the flip side, one could argue that silent movies are almost more universal. And I say that with kind of heavy quotations around universal. But because there's no language barrier necessarily, but at the same time, you're not expanding in the ways into other cultures that you are then able to with sound and increased diversity, where you actually hear the language and you have that sense of reality, which for some people, depending on where they lived at the time, that was probably the closest that they had ever been to actually experiencing that lifestyle or that culture as a whole.
Well, to take a page out of the book of old dialect, well, Goilies, let's get started with a little Broadway melody. Somebody has to laugh or respond or something. You can't just feel. You can't just die. Like, I had it way better. I had it way better the other day.
Perfect.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We have just wrapped up a Broadway melody, the Best Picture winner for the dual year 1928-29. The story is we've got two young sisters. They're kind of stage performers. They're into song and dance. They just arrive in New York after a period of time working as traveling performers. And with the help of their uncle and with the help of the sister Bessie Love's character's boyfriend in the city, Eddie, they're trying to get their start on Broadway in New York. And you have the two sisters. Their dynamic is interesting. Bessie Love's character, her character is more the leader of the two sisters. She's a little bit more hard-bitten and clever and kind of business-minded. And she's really driven that the two of them be successful in the city. Whereas maybe her younger sister, a little bit more naive, but certainly very beautiful. So that's kind of the dynamic. You have this kind of peppy, intelligent older sister who has this dream for the two of them, and the younger one that's just kind of finding her way as a young woman. And so they're getting their starts, and it's a struggle to get noticed by the producers and the directors. But again, with Bessie Love's boyfriend, Eddie's help, they kind of get their foot in the door into a play. And suddenly an opportunity opens up for the younger sister due to her looks. And so that starts to create a conflict, whereas the older sister, who encouraged them both to go out there, was really hoping that they would make it together. There's opportunities opening up for the younger sister because of her beauty and her charisma that maybe isn't being shared by both of them. In addition to that, the younger sister is starting to get, the attention of very prominent and wealthy men, in particular one who's very driven to kind of win her heart. And parallel to that, Bessie Love's boyfriend, Eddie, he falls head over heels in love for the younger sister as well, without Bessie Love's character realizing it. So they're trying to keep that under wraps. The younger sister is trying to figure out the right way to move ahead Where does her career fit in? Which one of these two gentlemen is the right fit for her? This wealthy guy who's very kind of leering, who's just showering her with gifts, or this young artist Eddie, who's also a stage performer, a very talented singer, star of several shows, kind of the more traditional artist type. Both are vying for her heart. And then you also have Bessie, who's slowly starting to realize over the course of this movie, maybe things aren't going to turn out in the way she had idealized. So the movie ultimately culminates in the sister, Bessie, the older sister, realizing that her love interest, Eddie, actually is totally in love with her younger sister. And you find out that the younger sister, feels the same way about Eddie. And in a moment of intensive sacrifice, which really carries a lot of weight on screen and reminded me a lot of the love triangle in Wings that I actually commented on while we were watching it, between, if you'll remember, the two soldiers and their mutual love for the same woman. In the same way that the one soldier who ultimately dies in that movie, David, sacrifices his life. In this case, Bessie sacrifices her chance at happiness with Eddie, maybe even her career in New York, to allow her sister to get with Eddie, so to speak, and she then has to move on with her own life and join the traveling circuit of performers again with a new co-star. So it's very bittersweet. It's kind of sad.
Mm-hmm.
The movie even hints at, in a what I thought to be a very transgressive way, and maybe again getting ahead of myself, but maybe the white picket fence ending for the younger sister that it appears to be in the traditional movie sense maybe won't work out that way. She's now giving up on her career, marrying Eddie and fully supporting him as he pursues his theatrical performance. Whereas, very interestingly, her older sister, who was always the more kind of driven one of the two, is going off on her own again. Maybe not in the center stage on Broadway, but still pursuing her dream in her own way. So really love to hear your two's perspective on the dynamic that sets up and the two choices that both characters make. But first of all, what was your reaction to the movie?
Yeah, we may have been a little harsh on early sound because this one definitely captured a lot of the strengths of sound. I know it took a lot of innovative techniques for them to get the sound balancing right, but it definitely paid off. I was really surprised by just how much better the sound quality was in this one versus the other movies we watched. But there were some aspects of it that were a little bit maybe melodramatic or cliche, but I was really invested ultimately in the characters. The love triangle, while to me it didn't make as much sense potentially as the one in Wings did, I think it allowed the showcasing of Bessie Love's talent as Hank in that kind of breakdown at the end of the movie to ultimately make it worth it. And I do think it's interesting, kind of as you stated, we have glimpses at what life might have in store for both of them in the future as they go their own ways. And to me, it doesn't seem likely that Hank will be successful, and it doesn't seem likely that Queenie will be happy. Yeah. This might just be me, looking at it in perhaps a more negative lens about what opportunities there may have been for women at that time. But I do think it's intentional. I think the act that Hank then goes on with the woman who replaces her sister, it's not as good. And I think that's acknowledged that it's kind of rough around the edges still. And she's putting on a brave face as they go on tour. And it definitely left me with a feeling of sadness overall. Yeah. But I appreciate that it wasn't just a very neat kind of happy ending, which again might be a recurring theme in some of my favorites. Like Wings also didn't have a neat happy ending. So yeah, I enjoyed it though.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I thought it was very gripping compared to the other, the other nominees we watched. I mean, I think part of that was because of the fact that the audio was a lot better. Yeah. And then I just felt also the pacing and kind of, I guess the writing and the acting in general was a little bit, well, not a little bit, I think it was a lot better. Mm-hmm. My main gripe though, I mean, it's similar to what you were saying, like with the love triangle. Like I do feel that Bessie Love, who played Hank, I felt like it kind of, as a viewer, we got to understand Hank's character a little bit more than we did Queenie, other than the fact that Queenie was the younger one. I guess she was supposedly like the trope of not as smart but beautiful. And I feel like they could have fleshed out her character a little bit more, because we understand that Hank wants to be, on Broadway, that's something that she's really determined and adamant to do. But we don't really ever understand if that's what Queenie wants. Yeah. We know that that's what she wants, because Hank made the decision to bring them both out there, because she wants to succeed in Broadway. And we know that, okay, Queenie obviously, I guess, has that, but at the same time, like, she kind of gave it up so easily once she got with Eddie, and she was like, okay, well, I'm fine. The only ties or connections to the stage I'll have is through my husband. Which is kind of like, I guess leaves it up for the viewer to be like, well, I guess she never really wanted that in the first place. Was she looking for partnership? Was that her main goal? Or, we don't really ever know what her desires are as a character, other than how other characters kind of reacted to her, but we don't really know her inner workings. But I mean, obviously, I feel like that's a little, I don't know, maybe reaching. I don't know.
No, I think it's maybe a good observation, because ultimately I think she is just a character who is being swept along by whoever has more control over her life. And even though she says she wants to make her own decisions, she has, throughout all of her early life, from what we see and can kind of infer from that, has left it up to her sister. And as soon as she gets involved with Eddie and, marries him in the end, she's leaving it up to Eddie. And I think in some ways that's kind of like a trope, right? Of like, oh, this is just kind of almost a side character where she doesn't get fleshed out as much. But at the same time, I think that is commentary just on that type of person in a way, and intentional or not, right? Where it's just like she's just going to get swept along with whatever ends up happening in her life.
Well, not to spoil anything from other media, but in the TV show Mad Men, particularly in the early seasons, does a great job of setting up a dichotomy between two characters of Peggy and the male character's wife, Betty. Betty is very beautiful. She's consistently related by other characters to Grace Kelly, whereas Peggy is more kind of regular looking person, but she's a hard worker and she's very talented. And the show talks about kind of in the female experience, and I guess, and in particular, even more patriarchal time periods than what we live in now. There's always that dichotomy between that choice that you have as a woman to go with a traditional life role, and maybe there are elements of that feel easy, at least in the short run, versus kind of going it alone and establishing yourself professionally and independently. Not to say they're mutually exclusive by any means, and I think, really healthy lives are ones that try to encompass all of that. But it's interesting to see that kind of choice that these female characters are facing in that time period in the late 20s that was still being faced by them in the 60s in Mad Men, and I think is still faced by them today as well. And this movie, I was so impressed that it was dealing with those kinds of themes. Maybe it wasn't as clear cut or refined as we're used to in much later media. But I thought it was effective, the dichotomy it set up there.
Yeah, I think also, like, jumping off of what you said about like how we have two characters, one kind of like falls into, I guess, a domestic role or more traditional, where she goes, okay, I'm just going to get married and, be a wife. And then the other sister who's trying to seek fame via Broadway. It also made me realize too, like, kind of like an inconsistency that I saw in the movie with Queenie's character, was that like she gets into kind of like a bit of a back and forth with Hank, her sister, and she starts getting mad at Hank and saying, I don't want to end up like those girls, married. I don't want to end up with like, and just being at home. But then at the end of the movie, that's what she ends up doing anyway. So I found like, it was an interesting inconsistency, because I was like, well, what do you want? But maybe
that was intentional.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Maybe that's what the director or whoever wrote the story intended, was to be like, well, because she's younger, she's still trying to figure out what she wants. But I just feel like it could have been done a little bit better and less confusing, I guess, just to show, like, as a character, like, what does she really want? But that is a really interesting connection, though, with the Mad Men. The way they explored that, I didn't really make that connection.
Well, it makes you realize these questions that we still grapple with today. even 100 years ago. They were
Yeah.
just as acute, but at its core, it's a lot of the same questions.
Right.
The one thing I will say though is that like I wish they would have maybe spent a little bit more time on the culmination after the climax, because I felt like they spent a lot of time on, okay, let's show like these two sisters performing, and watch them kind of almost rise up. But once, kind of like the climax of the story hit where, Queenie wants to start making her own decision. Eddie's pining after Queenie. Hank doesn't know. She's just trying to make it in Broadway. But once everything culminates, I felt like at the end it was kind of rushed. Like it's just like, okay, well, these characters kind of go off on their own and then that's it. And I mean, granted, sometimes like in stories, I like that because it leaves it up to the audience to, kind of come to their own conclusions. But I wish that there would have been a little, like the bow would have been tied up a little bit neater in a way as to like, like I would have liked to see kind of like a confrontation with Hank and Queenie, or a confrontation. Well, she did confront Eddie, but it was like a different way.
Yeah.
But just more of like an admittance to Queenie and being like, look, I know that this is what's going on. I want you to be happy type of thing. But I don't know. That's just like me, like a personal preference, because I feel like with her, leaving her just suffering.
It was,
I guess suffering in
it was tough to
silence.
watch,
It was like,
But I think I like that. I think I like basically Hank not coming out and spelling it all out for both of them, that like she, through her own sacrifice for her own happiness, or really she's just, it's a loss of what she thought she had.
Yeah.
She doesn't want that to impact their ability to be happy. And so I think it makes sense to not have that type of closure where Hank has a conversation with Queenie or with Eddie after the fact to let them know how she really felt. Because I think her goal was specifically to not let them see how it affected her so that they could move on.
Exactly. It speaks to, because she was so consistently self-assured as a human being throughout the storyline, in contrast to some of the other characters. In her sacrifice, she's displaying great agency, and it may appear on its surface that, she's losing out, so to speak, in the immediate sense. But I feel much more I know you kind of said, Sarah, you feel like it might not work out for either of them. But in comparison,
in my head canon,
Sarah's always like the
sad
dark ending.
yeah.
No, I, you know me, I'm the sappy one. I feel like that with Hank, Bessie Love's character, she has a wisdom that many of the other people around her don't. And though it may not work out in the way she had predetermined in her mind, she has the character and the forethought to react in these really powerful ways to the circumstances she's faced with, as we see in the climax of the movie. And that's going to, I feel, because she's still a very young woman, I feel that's going to serve her well in life, whether she ends up being a star performer or not. I feel like she will have less regretful life in the end, maybe, than her sister. Because even with Queenie at the end, everything's like all happy-go-lucky. They introduce, as you mentioned before, the older sister's new dance partner, and you can kind of see Eddie already eyeing her up. And Queenie notices this, and she's like, "Now listen here, you stick with me. We just got married." And Eddie kind of gives a look to his friend, like, "This new girl's pretty attractive." So you can kind of already see the groundwork being laid for potential heartbreak in their relationship, as we mentioned before. Whereas I don't feel like at this stage in Hank's life, she's faced with that kind of threat, so to speak.
Yeah. I was happy with the ending and the way that they kind of built that up and left it as is. But when thinking about the movie as a whole, it feels a little bit unbalanced because of how much time they spent on just the dancing and the various acts and stuff that they had in the middle, which I'm sure, again, it's an early sound movie. So getting to see that in theaters was probably much more engaging than maybe the way that we're sitting watching it now. But I wish that they had spent more of that time really fleshing out the love triangle a bit, only because it's very easy to kind of make this into a sad ending because Eddie, from what we saw, just loves Queenie because she's beautiful. Like, he saw her and was like, damn, I'm in love with her. And that was it. And because we don't see enough of Queenie's character, kind of like you had mentioned, we don't really know what she even wants out of life. It feels just like a very shallow relationship that develops between the two. And so if they had maybe spent a little bit more time looking at them as people, then I think it would really elevate the movie. But I understand that the point was to be a musical, right? To incorporate these acts and stuff. So that maybe was a secondary motivation. But just in retrospect, if I could change things about the movie, that would probably be my pick.
Yeah, that is true. Because I know when it came to the point when Queenie confesses her love for Eddie, it was kind of like way out of left field, because the entire movie, Eddie's pining after her, and she doesn't want to hear. She wants nothing to do with him. And then all of a sudden, in just like some scene, she's like, okay, yes, I love you. And then it becomes like, I don't know. It was very
that's
random.
why I think the most interesting relationship is between the two sisters, because in the same way that Queenie, it turns out, has been protecting Hank from the knowledge that Hank's boyfriend, Eddie, actually loves her more than Hank.
Right.
Then Hank, in the end, when she receives that information, she protects her sister by sacrificing her own romantic happiness, making a break with Eddie and kind of giving him permission to go off and pursue her sister. That's a real deep love, actually, between the two of them. And it's funny because up till that point in the movie, there's a lot of arguments. I said when we were watching, this reminds me of my younger sister when she was a teenager and my mom arguing. There's about it like, you can't tell me what to do, I'm going to live my life, kind of thing. And it seems like that's the dynamic. But then you have these small moments where it does really seem like they care. And in the end, both their actions display that that's the healthiest relationship in the movie. Even if they aren't physically close moving forward, they do respect and care for each other and make real sacrifices for each other's happiness. Hank in particular, in the end.
Yeah, it is true. Yeah.
Yeah, they do try to protect each other in their own ways. And I just have to shout out Bessie Love.
Yeah.
In general, she just has so much charisma and so much life that she brings to screen. And I think it really stood out among the cast. But when it kind of peaks at that moment where she lies to Eddie to get him to leave and chase after Queenie, and then has her breakdown, just sobbing and then kind of laughing hysterically and back to crying before she makes her decisions on how to move on. That was such powerful acting. And I know, Jake, you mentioned that she should have won the Oscar for that. She was nominated for Best Actress, and I think it was very much deserved. I have not watched the movie that Mary Pickford was in that she won Best Actress for that year, but I do know that she invited Academy members over to her house for tea to kind of petition for her winning. Like, Mary Pickford essentially was just like, hey, let's all go by my, home, just to hang out, just to talk. And she, of course, won. And I don't know, it feels a little bit shady.
Early Oscar campaigning. That's a big thing now. Now it's like a whole industry, if you can believe it. Like, it even goes so far as when a movie is in the planning stages, they're already setting up, okay, this is going to be nominated for this. That's like everything else.
You're taking the magic out of it.
Great point. Yeah, it's a great point that if it was a level playing field, would Bessie Love have won? Because, again, I also haven't seen Mary Pickford's performance that won that year. But by that point, she was a very established Hollywood figure, world figure, and her and Fairbanks lived in that palace. So you wonder, did she have an edge because of some politicking?
Right. Exactly. And that kind of just in general, right, is something that we have to ask ourselves of the Academy. If we know that they do it now, and it seems like they did it then, even for nominee choices, because what we keep bringing up is that so far the best pictures, and it's a small sample size, right, of this year and last, have been very good, but the nominees have felt a bit weaker, and we're only getting a small sampling of movies to watch from that era. And I have to wonder if there are movies that came out those years that were not nominated, perhaps for more political reasons and not necessarily but just social politicking, right, of actors or studios or directors that maybe were not quite as well received within the Academy itself. So
yeah, that's true. Because like with the Hollywood Review,
the one you fell asleep during,
yeah, the anthology of like different acts. I don't understand how that was a nominee.
Yeah.
At all.
You know what? I understand it when I think about Sarah's great explanation last time of why the Academy Awards even came into being in the first place. I mean, this was not viewed as a purely, meritocratic award system, at least at its inception. This was viewed as a way, number one, primarily, as Sarah said, to keep workers, actors, production crew, etc., in line by giving them little carrots instead of sticks for once in their lives. And then number two, as a way to showcase these big studios movies. And that film, even more than like some latter films that we'll talk about later, felt like the most hammed in nominee, because this is just basically a 2 hour, it was like gruelingly long, and it was like
it was too long.
big commercial for their stars, and it didn't even seem like any of the stars were happy to be there, to be honest, except for Bessie Love, who was great
Bessie Love.
in that too.
She's shown in that.
But we've been talking a lot about the story. Let's talk a little bit more about the musical aspect. I was pleasantly surprised because sometimes they can feel like the acts get in the way more so of the momentum of a story. I didn't think they really overdid it with the musical numbers here. It wasn't like musical number, 5 minutes of dialogue, musical number, 5 minutes of dialogue. I know we criticized a little bit they didn't do enough characterization, but in general, I felt like the story kind of led this movie. And there were songs that either deepened what the characters were saying, or there were songs that were just there kind of for their own sake, but in an impressive way. All that to say, I didn't feel like the musical element was burdensome as a viewer in the way that I have with other musicals.
I really love musicals. I know Chrysantha does too. So different viewpoint on my end, where there wasn't enough singing in this movie. But I do think that it's still interesting, as this is an early kind of prototype of a full musical, right? Where you have sequences where characters are singing at each other as well. The primary difference, though, I think, in a lot of modern musicals, or at least more modern than 1929, is that usually those sequences are meant to be fantastical. They're not rooted in realism. In this case, it did seem like, no, this man is literally singing the song that he wrote to her. So it was a little bit more grounded. So even though it obviously was a musical, there were songs that were sung by the characters in it. There were sequences of dance, but those were also stage sequences. It still did feel much more just realistic and grounded.
That's a good way to put
because
it.
this was in a world where they were performers, right? And so it was just part of their natural world. So I'm still waiting for the first true musical that we'll get to, which might be The Wizard of Oz.
Wants one page of dialogue and then
exactly.
Yeah, I would agree. Like when we decided to watch it and Sarah said, "Oh, it's a musical," I thought it was gonna have more like numbers. I guess. I mean, I still enjoyed it. It just wasn't what I was expecting. But I do know, like from the little bit of research that I did, was that this movie was it is the first musical to be considered or to win Best Picture. And it was also the first musical to have sequels come after it. Well, no, I wouldn't really say sequels because they're, from my understanding, from what I read, that the movies that came after, they have the same, title, like the Broadway melody, and then the years are different, and they don't ever, like, they don't tie into each other. Like they're each like a standalone story.
So like spiritual sequels.
Yeah, and I would like to watch the other ones just to know what their stories are about, because I wonder if it's more of like, if this was being sold as a box set, if it would be more of like, kind of like catering to people at the time who wanted to break into showbiz, because maybe somebody watching this during the late 20s, wanted to break into Broadway and then can kind of like relate a little bit to some of the issues that either Hank faces or Queenie faces with men being dogs and seeing like a beautiful woman and then being constantly oogled at and like chased
Harassed.
because of, yeah, essentially. And then it wasn't what I was expecting, but I do understand why it won Best Picture, and I do understand why it's also still categorized as a musical, because
For sure, yeah.
I feel like it was like a blend of film and musicals, and it's kind of like similar to how when I watched La La Land, how it's considered a musical, but it was more like instrumental, and then you're watching
That's a good comparison.
through the dance numbers, you kind of just infer emotion and stuff like that.
And that's probably why I
Yeah.
like La La Land too, because it feels very integrated into their world. It doesn't feel like, I know it's like cliche for boyfriends and guys to say, where it's like, why are they singing? People don't
But
break out into song.
I would say, though, La La Land is definitely more like the type of musical that I was talking about, in which the musical sequences where they are singing and dancing are very fantastical, are not rooted in reality. They're like a visual kind of magical realism interpretation of what's going on, which is what I enjoy about a lot of musicals. So I think it's kind of in between. In between.
I think the fantastical element I'm cool with. I just like it when it's like it feels natural to the story and it doesn't feel hammed in. And both of these movies I felt like did that, so I enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
Yeah.
I do have to wonder because at this point in time throughout the US, tons of theaters were still not outfitted for sound. They were not ready for movies to all be talkies, or especially musicals like this. And I know that there are silent versions of this movie, and I can't really imagine what that would be like, because sound is so important to this movie.
Yeah, that's interesting too, and it speaks to what we were saying before about how this is all still very much in flux, and you wonder if like you probably had to travel anyway to get to a decent theater, but maybe you have people traveling miles and miles and miles just to get to a theater equipped for sound. So it really does make it a communal and kind of momentous experience in the way difficult to imagine.
Maybe there were super fans who saw the silent version and they're like, wow, we need to travel to the nearest movie, what are they used to be called? Not Movie Palace, right? Movie Palace, where we can actually hear it.
So classy. No, it reminds me now of like, I'm like an IMAX snob. I'm like, oh, that movie you have to see in IMAX.
Yeah.
You can't see that in regular. So that's probably the same thing with the talkies and silence,
Well, something I did notice too was like I felt like there was a lot more music in this movie compared to like in old Arizona or
there was any music in old Arizona, was there?
Yeah, like I felt like it was quiet, and I felt like with this one with the dialogue and then the music adding to like certain scenes, I think that's maybe why it felt more lively than the other nominees, was because of that because of that. And I'm curious to see if it's something that continues on into the next years. Like if we watch the nominees and the best picture winner for the next year, if that becomes a trend and then becomes a norm in Hollywood, having both like dialogue and kind of like background, like setting the scene music.
I can only assume that it will become more and more prevalent in film. I think initially it was just limitations of recording, and we really saw that in The Alibi and in Old Arizona, where the sound mixing was not great. It was already hard to hear character dialogues, and I felt the same thing you did while watching them, that it was really lacking that kind of emotional underpinning that music adds to movies, and especially movies that we're used to, where it's there to kind of enhance things. We had that with the silent movies because they were almost all about that type of score, but really, really was missing it in
the other nominees of this year. In Old Arizona, I think they had a point where they put a record on and they danced to a song, but that was it. And it stood out to me like, oh, finally there's some music in this. And the Alibi, I think, maybe had one or two kind of sequences, but I fully agree in that it feels a little less impactful, a little more empty without the integration of music.
And compare that to the silent era when music was so important to the storytelling too, that I think was part of the reason why this transition to sound felt so jarring and like there was a little bit of a loss. But now I feel like I said, within 3 minutes of starting this movie, I am a sound convert. They have figured it out here. Like they're integrating it in a way that feels dynamic, that, like Chrysantha said, feels closer to what we're used to now. It was interesting. The first scene, it's very kind of auditorially chaotic because it opens on like a dance studio and there's people singing and recording studios, the guy singing at the piano, lots of sound. It's almost overwhelming. And you get the feeling that like maybe the intention there from the producers was to kind of overwhelm the audience with sound, say, this is the capabilities. So I think this movie is almost like a culmination of those fits and starts of the first year and a half or 2 years of sound. This is the industry saying, okay, we're starting to get our footing here, and this is how you use it to the benefit of a production. So even in that way, I feel like this is a really historically important film, certainly.
I wonder if at the time with the implementation of sound, if directors thought that like, okay, since we already have sound, we have audio, we don't have to use those little cue cards on screen, so I guess we don't have to rely much on music for setting the scene either. So I wonder if that's a factor, or maybe that was like a mentality that was adopted at the time that factored into the lack of music in certain scenes, or if it was just, I don't know, just them getting used to having sound. Because like, since you mentioned having this this movie also released in, I guess, a silent version, it does make sense, because when I reflect back on the film, like they did have certain title cards to indicate setting changes, and because there was a lot more music in the scenes, it would make sense, like if you're editing it, okay, we have music in the film, we can just take the audio for the dialogue out, and that way the music can still convey the emotion of the scene that we want the audience to get. Yeah. And then we can just input cue cards for dialogue just to set the setting or the general information for what is being said between the characters. And so it makes sense for this movie. And it's, I don't know, I think it's pretty interesting too that it won, because I feel like it does translate very beautifully. I can see it for a silent film as well as a talkie.
Yeah. Well, looking at the bigger picture here, it struck me that so many of the movies we've watched so far have centered on love triangles at the center of their story. And I sort of feel like, in the same way that the difficult choices faced by women in their lives remains like a timeless, resonating storyline, so too did this idea of love triangles. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, we've got this Broadway Melody, Old Arizona from this year, Alibi. There was a little bit of a love triangle going on where she's kind of caught between the criminal element guy and the police element guy. And then obviously Wings, love triangle central to that story. It's just interesting to me how much this story tool has been used. And I kind of feel like, I don't know, it might just be the movies that I watch nowadays being less like I don't watch a lot of rom-coms or anything. So I don't see a lot of it, but it kind of feels like it's interesting that the movies that were getting the most traction, let's say back then, focused on this timeless topic. And I wonder if that will continue to hold up.
I think that's a very poignant thought to basically transition into our closure here.
So now comes the question, do you guys think this movie deserved the win?
I definitely think so. I don't know how much of that was due to weak contenders this year, to be honest. Like, I wouldn't put this on the level of Wings, but it was enjoyable, and I would say it, out of what we watched, it deserved to win.
Yeah, I agree. As much as I kind of Loved the weird and awkward, like racism, but also incredible twist of old Arizona. I think that this was a better movie. It executed the sound better. It had more of a I always look out in movies like, does it have a little something for everyone? Like, are you going to be able to all enjoy this no matter what walk of life you're from? And I feel like this one captured that. And yeah, I just really enjoyed it and always enjoy watching it with you guys.
Yeah, I say it definitely deserved it. I enjoyed it a lot more than I did the others. I mean, I did enjoy old Arizona, but I feel like, I don't know. If the audio were better, maybe I would have
Yeah.
been able to catch certain things more or like understand a little bit more, like in terms of dialogue and stuff. But yeah, without a doubt, I definitely do think this movie deserved the win for Best Picture.
Well, unanimous decision there. Of the movies that we watched from this year of the Oscars, which ones do you guys think are still worth watching today?
I definitely think the Broadway Melody. I enjoyed that movie quite a bit. I don't know if you guys will agree with me, but I honestly feel like you can skip the nominees.
Okay. I thought you were going to say the Hollywood Review as like a total plot twist when you said that we wouldn't agree. But okay. All right. Sorry. Keep going.
No, I feel like definitely skip the Hollywood Review. You don't have to watch that at all. But I don't know. Like, I feel the Alibi was good. I did enjoy watching it. Mm-hmm. But if I were to recommend it, it would just be from like a historical standpoint, just because, like we talked about, it's looking at the police force in a kind of like a critical view. Mm-hmm. And that's not really something that I would expect for that time. So I just like a historical standpoint, I guess, that movie. But other than that, I would honestly say you can skip the others, but maybe watch Broadway Melody is good. I did like that. That's a good movie. You can definitely watch that one.
So yeah, as you say, Broadway Melody, really cool movie. I even as not a musical guy necessarily, I did enjoy it, as we just talked about, and I would certainly recommend it to people who do like that genre of film, certainly. But if you're like me and you're fascinated by dialects, maybe even, from an acting perspective or just for its historical value, I would recommend In Old Arizona just because of that one character and kind of the manners of speech. Also the Cisco Kid, although it was kind of a caricature and a brown face. I just thought it was interesting that the terms they would use and the phrasing. So I would say that. The Alibi, it was cool, but I don't know that I'd watch it again. I thought Chester Morris was a good performance in it. That was kind of stuck out in my memory, but yeah, that's kind of my feeling about this year. Introduction of sound overall, I think redeemed by the Broadway Melody, but I think they're still finding their sea legs here.
Yeah, I think same sort of thoughts here. Nothing super surprising. I think the Broadway Melody was enjoyable. I think it's worth watching, but honestly, even the Broadway Melody, I would say, if you are going out of your way to kind of track these movies down because you want to see like a really good movie, I don't know that even the Broadway Melody necessarily passes that bar for me, though it was good, it was solid, it was enjoyable. There were some great performances overall in that, especially that scene that we've talked about with just that breakdown towards the end. So I think it's a good watch, but I wouldn't be like, go out and watch it today. But definitely of this year, that's the one I would most strongly recommend. In Old Arizona, it honestly was enjoyable. And again, as we've mentioned, the sort of problematic elements aside, but in some ways, it's nice that those characters, as I mentioned, were represented in mostly positive ways or at least neutral ways. So even though it may have been harder to actually get those roles if you were a minority, then at least we're starting to see some positive portrayal, So that one, if it's on, it is good. It has that sort of like twist ending that I enjoyed. The Alibi had some good elements, had some interesting elements, and then Hollywood Revue was just I don't, if you want to torture yourself and are just like interested in seeing like how bad can things possibly be, then maybe give that one a watch. But I don't know, overall this year was not as strong for movies so far, I think. No one's going to disagree with me. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm looking forward to next year's Oscars. I know we have obviously one that most of us are familiar with because of remakes, All Quiet on the Western Front. So kind of high expectations with that. Our other nominees are The Big House, Disraeli, The Divorcee, and The Love Parade. So be sure to tune in, follow, join us on this journey as we go through the years.